Right. Hey, good evening, everyone. Thank you once again for having me. I love frigid cold nights because it means you have nothing else to do but come in here and listen to me gab about history. And tonight I'm finishing up the third in a series on the Salem witch trials. I want to let people know that these talks are recorded and they are shown later, if you don't know, on 956? Right. Yes, the in-house channel 956. So if you could get that, then, and you're not here, you could watch it. But if you recall, the Salem witch trials, a most extraordinary episode in our history. Beginning in January 1692, the people, the residents of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, just almost inexplicably turned on each other, accused each other of witchcraft. And by the time it was all over, hundreds had been accused, hundreds have been tried, hundreds more had fled the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and 20 had been executed. Another 5 had died in jail. It was a catastrophe from which Puritan New England never recovered. I would say that 1692 marks the end of what we call Puritan America. And I would also say that the catastrophe of the Salem witch trials, which was so shameful to the people of New England, was the final act, I think, that set our country on the path to religious liberty, committed this country to the ideal of religious liberty. Last time, I talked about a climate of fear that pervaded the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 1690s because of the religion. The Puritan religion, which I argued, and some people weren't happy with that, but I do believe it, the Puritan religion was one that was designed to put people in a state of fear and anxiety. Fear and anxiety from which you would then recover and hopefully understand the nature of your own salvation. Tonight, I want to talk about more material fears that gripped the Massachusetts Bay Colony after 1660 or so and began to tear it apart. And this fear, I think, can best be summed up as the fear of the loss of control over this Puritan experiment, this Puritan commonwealth that had been created in 1630. Now remember, the first 800 Puritans who came over on the Arabella and landed in Salem in June 1630, they were here on a mission, what they called an errand into the wilderness, to create a godly commonwealth that would be seen as a model Christian community for the rest of the world to follow. These were not humble people in that sense. The Pilgrims were humble. They wanted to forget the world. They wanted the world to forget them. The Puritans were not. The Puritans were on a global stage as they saw it. They were trying to demonstrate the efficacy of creating a biblical commonwealth, a biblical community where people are living on biblical principles. And the shining example of what they called the city on a hill, which became Boston, would then reform and purify the Church of England, reform and purify England and the rest of Christendom, hopefully even converting those reprobate Catholics who were pretty much Satan worshipers because they were, papists, as the Puritans called them. This Puritan experiment, which began in 1630, is crazy. I mean, they're coming to a new world that was not settled, that was inhabited by Native Americans. And they think they're going to set up like a biblical And they did it. They did it beyond, to a success beyond their wildest expectations. By 1660, I argued and tried to demonstrate, Puritan New England was probably the healthiest, the wealthiest, and the most educated society on earth. I mean, Puritan New England, this thing just took off. And the blessings of God just poured on them year after year after year. It was very clear to the Puritans that they were on the right path and God was blessing this experiment. And then, beginning in 1660, things started to change. Things started to go downhill. The Puritans started losing control. It turns out it's almost as if Puritan New England succeeded too well. Is that how I should put it? There should be a turn of phrase for this, you know. Succeeded so much that their success almost undid them, or did undo them, because Puritan New England grew enormously, so that thousands upon thousands more people from England and elsewhere wanted to come and live in Puritan New England to enjoy the fruits of this new commonwealth. And some of these newcomers, they had some different ideas about how to worship God and what the Bible said. Some of them came really because they wanted to make money, because Puritan New England was so incredibly wealthy for a tiny little colony. And you could see here by 1700, you know, Boston Harbor is filled with ships of trade, and ships with newcomers. So beginning in 1660, Puritan New England, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, begins to get more modern, more secular, more diverse, wealthier than it ever had before. And the people who were the true believers in that founding Puritan generation, that heroic generation that came across the ocean and carved this commonwealth out of nothing, the people who really worshiped this founding generation felt that the Massachusetts Bay Colony was betraying the vision of the founders, betraying the vision that had carried Puritan New England as far as it did. And there was a lot of conflict within this growing Massachusetts Bay Colony over the changes that were overtaking the colony. Some more liberal, more modern, younger types embraced the changes. Some older, more old-fashioned, traditional, resisted the changes. And that conflict erupted, I would argue, in 1692 in the Salem witch trials. That's what the Salem witch trials really was all about. And I want to walk through how the witch trials, I want to walk through the changes that took place, and then how the witch trials, I think, express the conflict over these changes. So, but first I want to go back to 1630 and explain how the Puritans got away with what they did. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was a private, corporately chartered colony, not controlled by the crown. And the investors and the founders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony got away with everything they wanted to do. They never had to listen to the crown. They had their own governor. They had their own office holders. They had their own laws and their own charter. They minted their own money, which was wildly against the law. They traded directly with other European countries, which they were not permitted to do. And they got away with it because back in England, the monarch was preoccupied with other problems. The monarch at the time, this guy, Charles I, boy, was he a piece of work. He hated the Puritans, and he hated the non-conforming Protestants that were organizing in Parliament. And so in 1629, he called Parliament together, and they asked him too many questions, demanded power sharing. So he dismissed Parliament in 1629 and did not call Parliament back into session until 11 years later, 1640. This is the era, the 11 years of personal rule of Charles I, where he tried to rule without Parliament, and without Parliament he could persecute Puritans left and right, which of course sent thousands of them across the ocean to Barbados and the Caribbean, and also to New England. Eventually, he ran out of money. The one thing that Parliament could do that the king can't do on his own under the British Constitution is raise money. Well, he can't do it very easily. So he ran out of money. He called Parliament in 1640. He got into a big argument with Parliament. Parliament essentially declared war on the crown. This is the English Civil War. Very destructive, very deadly, and it went on, as you could see, for 8 years. Finally, 1649, King Charles is captured by the parliamentary Puritan New Model Army, the first modern army in European history, the Puritan New Model Army. The New Model Army captures the king, King Charles I, puts him on trial for treason, finds him guilty, and cuts off his head. Not only do they cut off the head of the monarch, these are the Puritans, they eliminate the monarchy. And instead, they declare Parliament's in charge with a Lord Protector, a Puritan named Oliver Cromwell, who rules England for 10 years until 1660. Well, he ruled it. He died before that, but he handed it over to his son. And by 1660, it's all over. So during this 30 years of turmoil in England, Charles and the Crown and England had absolutely no wherewithal to pay any attention to what was going on in New England. And they allowed the Puritans to do whatever they wanted. And the Puritans did. They had a free hand. The Puritans were unbelievable. They were able to, they had a charter from Massachusetts, which was pretty small. And they just ignored the charter and went wherever they wanted to. Pretty much the Massachusetts Bay Colony controlled the Plymouth Colony, New Hampshire, Maine. They had a big hand for a long time in Connecticut, in Rhode Island. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, these Puritans spread out wherever they could, and they were very imperial in a sense. And controlled more and more territory. And even as they're growing, they are instilling or impressing upon the communities they control the Puritan way of religion. You'll remember, it was a very strict religion. You had to go to church twice a week by law, whether you were a believer or not, on Wednesday and on Sunday. Church service was 4 hours long, longer and more boring than this lecture. 4 hours long on Wednesday, 4 hours long on Sunday. I mean, it was, and that's where they taught you how to read the Bible. They taught you how to understand the true religion. And this was a extremely tight, for such a sprawling colony that it became, it was extremely tightly controlled. And the Puritans controlled it, And this is what church looked like. Benches without backs. 4 hours. Temperature, ideal temperature, and I remember reading this. The ideal temperature in the room was considered to be like 50 degrees, because any warmer people will fall asleep. So women, men on the left, women on the right, and this is how it was throughout Puritan New England. As the colony grew, as you could imagine, into 50,000, 70,000, people started coming in because they had been driven out of England. They were non-conforming Protestants. They didn't like the High Church of England Anglican style. And so they came and settled in places like Salem and Boston, like this guy did, Roger Williams, who came from England, moved to Salem, then moved to Boston. And it turned out he had some different ideas about what the Bible, he didn't always agree with what the minister said. He didn't think that there should be rules where you have to go to church or you have to confess a certain faith. He didn't think that the current Puritan rule was that if you were a Puritan full member of the church, and not everybody was, maybe a third of the population was, you had to be a full member of the church to hold any office, to own a lot of land. Roger Williams didn't believe that these offices, these government offices, should be open to everybody. Eventually, of course, because the Puritans are in charge, they're able to banish him. And he goes south and he founds the city of Providence, Rhode Island. You have people starting to sneak in to Puritan New England. These are horrible people. I don't know if you know any, maybe you are some of them. They're called Quakers. And man, are they annoying. Because what they do, well, their heresy is this. And I'm going to try not to go too far into my digressions here. But their heresy, according to the Puritans, is this, is they believe they could hear God's voice. They believe that God dwells within everybody. And that if you're quiet enough, contemplative enough, pray enough, you could hear it. You could begin to hear it. And their meetings were extraordinary. They were extemporaneous. They weren't like the sermons that you get in a Puritan meeting house. They were kind of extemporaneous celebrations of the Spirit that people connected to within. The Puritans did not believe God spoke to you. The Puritans believed that God never spoke to people at all. Only a tiny percentage, of course, of the world's population was saved, was the elect. The rest of them were going to be damned to hell. And God never spoke to anybody. If you heard a voice, it was definitely Satan. So they were convinced that the Quakers had been tricked by Satan and were going down the wrong path. And that would have been okay, but the Quakers were insistent on evangelizing. So they banged pots and pans outside of a Puritan meeting house. They distributed leaflets. They were really disruptive, crazy people. And one of the craziest of the crazy people was Mary Dyer. They told her to stop. She wouldn't. They told her to stop again. She wouldn't. They put her on trial. They put her in jail. She got out. She kept on banging pots and pans. Finally, they hanged her on Boston Common in 1660 for her heresy. Anne Hutchinson, you know about her. She's another one. She was, I will say, and again, I do not want to, I get off on these tangents, but I just think the case of Anne Hutchinson is so interesting to me. She was such a devout Puritan. She did not, unlike Mary Dyer, unlike Roger Williams, she was not a heretic. She believed everything the mainstream Puritans believed. The only thing that she did wrong was be a woman. I really think that's it. She was really, really smart. Here she is as an image of her on trial. At this point, she's 41 years old and pregnant with her 14th child. Her real sin, her real crime was she was convening people in her house. It was like an after party of church. You go to the meeting house for church, and then you go to her house to hear the real story. And she had too many followers. I think she was just competing too well with the Puritan hierarchy. So she was banished and fled to Rhode Island and eventually was killed by Native Americans in New York. Hutchinson Highway, right? The Hutchinson Highway, New York City. I think that's where she lived, was killed. Speaking of Indians, the other thing that the Puritans were able to do that the Crown absolutely did not want them to do was fight Indians. The crown did not, the English crown did not want the Puritans to go out there and start attacking Indian villages, because that meant the Native Americans were going to fight back, there's probably going to be a war, and then the British crown would have to send troops over to save the day. So they were constantly telling the Puritans, don't start a war, don't start a war. But the Puritans wanted land, they wanted more trade routes, they wanted an alliance with the Narragansetts, and so in 1636, 1637, the Puritans with the Narragansett allies launched a war against the Pequot Indians and destroyed them utterly. There may be 1 or 2 or 5 Pequot alive today, but they don't speak the language, they don't really know the culture. This war wiped out the Pequot Indians in New England. But once again, the Puritans had a free hand to do all this until Charles I's son, Charles II, son of the king who had been beheaded, comes back in 1660, and he ain't happy with the people who chopped his dad's head off. And he comes into power, and then is succeeded by his younger brother, and very quickly reassert control. This is called the Restoration of the monarchy, and begins to sweep the Puritans out of power, sweep them into prisons, and then reaches across the ocean and tries to bring Puritan New England under some kind of control. And one of the first things that Charles II does is he creates a rival colony to the south called Rhode Island. Anybody here from Rhode Island? Okay, all right. You're just not admitting it. Rhode Island. This Rhode Island was not, you can't say that the crown created Rhode Island, but the crown kind of rechartered Rhode Island and really promoted it as a colony that would be the rival to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. This colony, which was given a royal charter in 1663, was explicitly committed to religious liberty or religious toleration. This is what the charter says: no person at any time hereafter shall be anywise molested, punished, disquieted, or called into question for any differences in opinion in matters of religion. So immediately, all those discontents in England who wanted to flee but were afraid to go to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, now they had somewhere to go. They went to Rhode Island. And man, did they pour into Rhode Island. So that Rhode Island just balloons in population and does become a rival. The other thing that Rhode Island commits itself to is not getting involved in Indian wars. Every piece of land will be purchased from the Indians. It wouldn't be acquired through war. It shall not be lawful for our said colony of Rhode Island to invade or molest the native Indians or any other inhabitants inhabiting within its bounds and limits. Also, the people of Rhode Island were not allowed to go elsewhere and fight in Indian wars. This was intended to kind of rein in the Puritans in another way. I love this quotation. When the Puritans, when they heard that the charter was created and that Rhode Island was taking off, the Puritans in Massachusetts, of course, were not happy about that. This is what one minister said. Rhode Island, I love how it's spelled, the way it should be spelled. Rhode Island is a chaos of all religions. It is the asylum for all those that are disturbed for heresy, a hive of hornets, and the sink into which all the rest of the colonies empty their heretics. The people are a heterogeneous lump of familists, antinomians, Quakers, Seekers, and anti-Sabbatarians. Wow. Charles II followed up with the creation of Rhode Island with 2 more colonies that we don't normally associate with religious freedom, but they were, as a matter of course, granted religious freedom. New York and New Jersey. I mean, Rhode Island was so religiously free, get this. Jewish people started moving there. and created a synagogue. It's really Catholics, just absolutely unbelievable. And then, as if to rival Rhode Island, 1682, I mean, can you be any more explicit than this? King Charles II calls his old buddy William Penn a Quaker and says, wouldn't you like your own colony just for Quakers? And William Penn, bless his heart, says, yes, but we also want to invite all the peoples of the world there too, and so that we could, this was truly his idea. Wouldn't it be interesting, he thought, if we talk about a utopian, wouldn't it be interesting if we had a colony where we explicitly invited people of different religious faiths to come and we create a commonwealth together? That's wacko. That's wacko for the 17th century, and he does it. All of a sudden, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which had been, had ruled the roost for so long, now it was almost as if the colony was under siege. The Crown started to try to seize control of the Massachusetts Bay Colony by compelling the colony to accept laws passed in England that would be enforced on the ground of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Puritans resisted, and finally, in 1684, the Crown under James II, Charles II's younger brother, kind of chose the nuclear option. He revoked the Massachusetts Bay Colony charter, revoked the charters of all the other colonies that the Massachusetts Bay Colony exerted some control over, and then declared this entire area the Dominion of New England, which would be directly under Crown control. All the Puritan judges, all the Puritan sheriffs, all the mayors, all the office holders were kicked out of their offices. All the large Puritan landholders had their land taken away. You had to reapply for these land patents. This was now Crown territory, and Crown law was imposed beginning in 1684 in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. This was a catastrophe for the Puritans. All of a sudden, and the Crown, King James II, chose his own personal representative, a military man, Edmund Andros, to come and be the military governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and enforce all these laws. It was horrible. In Boston on a Sunday in 1686, you could walk down the street and hear the most awful sound that would just send a chill down your spine. Do you know what it was? People singing in church, which the Puritans never did. You could not sing in church. You did not have art in church. There's no choir in the Bible, But because of the Dominion of New England, the first Anglican church ever was built in Boston, and they had a big choir and made sure that all the Puritans heard the singing on Sunday there. This was a church is still there. It's just an example, like an emblem of the Crown control of this new colony. This Dominion of New England wouldn't last too long, because James II, the King of England, he didn't last too long, because he was Catholic. What the heck? And his son was Catholic, the would-be James III. And this was so verboten in England that Parliament invited, this story, Parliament invited the Dutch king to come and invade England and capture the English king and kick him out. So the English king leaves. This is James II fleeing England. The Dutch army comes in. King William comes with his wife Mary, who is James II's daughter, but she's Protestant. This is such I hate the British monarchy. It just is so crazy. It's so hard to keep straight and very convoluted. But yes, James II had a daughter who married the King of Holland, and she was Protestant, unlike her father, and so they became William and Mary, and they started a new dynasty. That meant when Puritan New England got the news that James II was gone, the Puritans captured the governor, Edmund Andros, put him in jail, then put him on a jail ship and sent him back across the ocean. 1689 to 1692. 1689 is the end of the Dominion of New England and the beginning of the reassertion of the Puritans back over the Massachusetts Bay Colony. 1692 is the year when the Salem witch trials began. These 3 years are tumultuous years, as you could imagine, in New England. You have these Puritans who had been out of power, now rushing back to try and regain power, right? And settling scores with those residents of New England who had cooperated with the crown, who maybe had traded with Quakers, who had gone to the Anglican Church. There is an internal battle now, a civil war going on, a very low-level civil war going on within Puritan New England over who would control the colony from here on in. The old line Puritans are trying to reassert themselves, whereas the new generation that had come in with the Dominion of New England and even earlier were trying to keep the more secularized, the more modern version of New England. And this is where we get into the question of, if we have this background, if we understand this background in the context of the conflict between those who embraced the change and those who resisted it, I think we could begin to understand why some people get accused of being witches and other people become the accusers. You know? There are reasons why Rebecca Nurse was accused, but not Mercy Lewis. And historians have done a lot of great work over hundreds, ever since the 20th century, the turn of the 20th century, trying to match traits and characteristics that all the accusers had in common, and then traits that all the accused had in common. And there are a lot of them. And these two groups are demographically very distinct. But I just want to go through 3 major traits, 3 major correlations that the accusers had in common and that the accused had in common. Okay. Oh boy. I'm going to show you a graph. Be patient with me. The people who were accused of being witches, one of the things they had in common was they were friendly with Quakers. That means maybe they were married to one. Maybe their cousin had married one. Maybe they served them, Quakers, in their boarding house. Maybe they were neighbors of Quakers. Maybe they did trade with Quakers. Maybe they took out a loan from a Quaker banker, and the Quakers were big into banking. There was some relationship. The accused had some relationship with Quakers. Those who were accusers tended not to know any Quakers whatsoever. Here's a graph. This x-axis shows, on the left here, this is the closer you are to this axis here, the more likely you are to be an accused. The farther you are over here, the more likely you are to be an accuser. The higher you are up here, the more likely you are to be intolerant of Quakers. The lower you are down here, the more likely you are to be tolerant of Quakers. So you can see this graph. These dots are people. And if we take each resident of Salem and we plot them on this graph according to their Quaker relations and according to whether they were part of the accused or part of the group of accusers, boy, you see this correlation very strongly. The more tolerant you are of Quakers, the more likely you are to be accused. The more intolerant you are of Quakers, the more likely you are to be an accuser. And this is exactly how it breaks down. It's remarkable. Rebecca Nurse, you'll remember her. She was the shocker, 71-year-old, very devout woman, hadn't offended anybody ever. She was accused of being a witch and she was executed. She had a cousin who had married a Quaker. And she was friendly with Quaker families. She thought they were heathens and heretics, but she socialized with them. Here's another correlation. People who get accused. There are more Indian wars after the Pequot War of 1637, and those who tend to suffer in these wars tend to become accusers, and those who remain somewhat distant from the war tend to get accused of being a witch. So the big war after the Pequot War was the King Philip's War, named after this guy, King Philip Metacomet, Narragansett Indian, and it was a huge war. The Narragansett and the Wampanoag got together and they fought the Puritans. The Puritans requested aid from the mother country, which was not sent, and so the Puritans fought this devastating war that killed 30% of the Puritan population of New England. 30%. It's considered the most deadly war in American history per capita. Here's another chart. Who escaped trauma or harm by the Indians? Accused on the left, accusers plotted on the right, low trauma on the left, high trauma on the right. And you can see once again, wow, does that plot, that plot line is just remarkable. It's very clear. The more likely you are to have been traumatized in the Indian Wars, the more likely you are to accuse people of being a witch. The less harmed you are by the war, the less likely you are to be accused. Mercy Lewis, she's a great example. 16-year-old girl accuses a lot of people. She saw her brothers, her sister, and her parents killed by Indians with her own eyes. She was there, a witness. Plus, all her grandparents, all her aunts and uncles, and all her cousins were killed by Indians. She was alone in the world, living as an orphan. She accused a lot of people of being witches. Rebecca Nurse, her and her family were never harmed in the Indian Wars. Here's the third correlation, which I think is the most important and most fascinating. It's one of geography. This is a map of Salem Village. And you'll remember that there's Salem Village, which is the Salem we're talking about, and there's Salem Town right here. This is what we call Salem today. Salem Village is now called Danvers, Massachusetts. Salem Village is on the outskirts of Salem Town. And here's a dashed line that divides Salem Village into West Salem Village and East Salem Village. These A's represent the homes and the location of the homes of accusers, people who publicly accused others of being witches. Over in the east, these W's are the homes of people who are accused of being witches, and D's are the homes of people who defended them, the witches. Wow, look at this map. Almost all the accusers come from West Salem Village. And almost all the accused come from East Salem Village. What the heck is happening? There's some kind of deep division. that's going on in Salem, Salem Village, between those who live on the west and those who live on the east. And in 1692, that division got deadly. Here's what was happening. This is a product, this conflict between west and east is a product of Puritan settlement patterns. When the Puritans came, when any of these migrants came, they came to the New World and they selected a perfect location for their town. Well defended from Indians, navigable river, dry land where you could build a road maybe to another town, a good, well-protected harbor, a good, clean water source. All these things were considered until closely before you settled in a town. Then, once the town was settled, newcomers came in, and they were pushed, of course, to the outskirts of town. They had to live on the outskirts, like here. This is exactly what happened with Salem. Here is a map of Salem, 1692. Salem town is right here, and you could see why it was chosen. Just this wonderful, deep harbor, great for ships, well protected. They have these estuaries and rivers that connect to other areas. And so Salem town, when it was founded, and it was founded before Boston, this was a perfect place for a town. Then, as people moved in, Salem town filled up, and Salem Village was created. But it was created, the people who lived in Salem Village along the east, they were close enough to enjoy a lot of the benefits of Salem town. They lived within 5 miles of the meeting house. That was kind of the requirement, a kind of a rule of thumb that if you lived within 5 miles of the meeting house, that meant that you could walk to church twice a week. But then Salem Village filled up, and West Salem Village then was created. So this village, and there was a long running battle between Salem Village and Salem Town. These people who lived in West Salem Village, they were like, I've got to walk 8 miles to church. We need our own meeting house. And in Puritan New England, if you build your own meeting house, you're a town. Salem Town did not want to give Salem Village up. They wanted Salem Village to pay their taxes to the town. But eventually, finally, not long before the Salem witch trials, Salem Town surrendered and gave Salem Village its own corporation, and Salem Village became its own incorporated town. So over time, the people who lived on the eastern side of Salem Village really began to benefit from all of the activity that was taking place along the harbor. Whereas the people who lived in the western side of Salem Village, they continued to live like this. Very traditionally, a subsistence economy. Very much different from the people who lived in Salem Town and East Salem Village. The people who lived in East Salem Village and Salem Town, they were connected to the global economy. I mean, very seriously, to the triangular trade. They were buying rum from the Caribbean. They were trading it. They were selling timber to Europe. I mean, they were buying and selling slaves. They were involved in sugar trade. I mean, they were involved in shipbuilding. There was some manufacturing going on. This was a vibrant, growing, economically, beneficial place, Salem Town. And the people in East Salem Village were close enough to these waterways and to these roadways where they could benefit from a lot of that activity. They even had roads. The Ipswich Road, which ran to Boston, the Topsfield Road. You could see these are lined with taverns and boarding houses and shops so that travelers coming from Boston, could stop and stay overnight. In other words, the people who lived here, they were connected not only to the village, but to places outside of the village, other towns. Not here. They had one road. Do you know where it goes? Indians. It ended in the wilderness. I mean, it was almost like this great welcoming road for come and invade. West Salem Village less protected from Native Americans than East Salem Village. The people in East Salem, they were able to get into the forts in Salem town. The people in West Salem Village, they couldn't get there, and they tended to be chopped down by Native Americans. They have a great river, Ipswich River. It's great, except you can't sail a boat in it because it's too shallow. You know, there's just no economic development taking place in West Salem Village. Salem Village is stagnating. And meanwhile, the ministers tend to be people who are connected to the old ways, to the old, traditional Puritans. And they begin to criticize, the ministers do, the wealth that's building in places like Salem town. Here's a guy on the left, his name is John Freak, great name. He immigrates to Salem in 1658. He's a Puritan. He's also a brewer, a banker, an attorney, a shipbuilder, and a landowner. He is one of the wealthiest men in Salem. And he doesn't look like a Puritan to me. I mean, come on, look at these, you call these crenulated cuffs? He has this lace collar from Venice. He is showing off a silver brooch here. He's got that pinky ring. He's got these imported gloves. He has these 24 silver buttons on his velvet jacket. I mean, he's clearly showing off his wealth. And people like John Higginson, who was a minister, would week after week begin to sermonize about the sin of wealth. We are losing our way. This is not the New England that our fathers envisioned. This is not what Puritan New England or the Massachusetts Bay Colony was intended to be. We're being drawn away by the lures of wealth. Higginson says, "My fathers and brethren, this is never to be forgotten, that New England is originally a plantation of religion, not a plantation of trade. Let merchants and such as are increasing cent per cent remember this. Let others that have come over since understand this, that worldly gain was not the end and design of the people of New England, but religion. And if any man amongst us makes religion as 12, and the world as 13, let such a one know he hath neither the spirit of a true New England man, nor yet of a sincere Christian." This is a very serious condemnation of the kind of extravagance that is building in Puritan New England. These kind of sermons happen all over New England, week after week, over years, many years. These sermons are published, they're read, and one scholar in the 1980s, his name is Sack Van Berkovich, I remember reading this and being very struck by it, wrote a book he read all these sermons, and he wrote a book about them. And I read that book and was very struck by his argument. He argued that all of these sermons can be summed up as a literary genre called a Jeremiad, named after the book of Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah. This is Jeremiah. He's not a happy guy. Jeremiah, and he's not happy because the Jewish people, have been exiled in Babylon for generations. And so they've forgotten their religion. All they care about is becoming like Babylonians. They want to be rich, they want to be wealthy. He's like the only guy left who has a true religion. And he's a prophet. And he tells the Jewish people, you've got to remember the faith of our nation. You've got to have faith in Israel. You don't just, don't abandon the father's faith for the allures of wealth. And he says, if you do, or because you are doing this, horrible things are going to happen to us. The days of trouble is near, days of humiliation, times of affliction, righteousness rained from heaven. These were all the predictions that Puritan New England was going to hell in a handbasket, and it was your fault. You have to straighten up. Sack Van Berkovich argued, to me, and I haven't read the book in a long time, but boy, it was very convincing. He said, this form of rhetoric, this form of argument is so effective that it has leached into our political system. And that if you analyze the great speeches in American history, they almost all invoke the Jeremiad. Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr. You go on and on. And once you understand the Jeremiad as a form, you begin to see it everywhere. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And you know that I don't talk about politics here, but I do when I think our politics do reflect some kind of historical tradition or heritage. Absolutely, I think President Donald Trump has tapped into the Jeremiad to deliver his message. And I think that's why the Trump message is so powerful with so many people. You could really say, it is not an exaggeration to say, that the Salem witch trials was really a feud between two Salem families, the Putnams in West Salem and the Porters in East Salem. The Putnams, these are families who immigrated around the same time. They had about the same number of family members. They had about the same amount of wealth and land, and they were constantly fighting with one another, and they grew very much apart. The Porters were very involved with transatlantic trade. The Putnams remained very traditional and in a subsistence kind of farming. The Putnams end up becoming the major accusers of the Salem witch trials. Ann Putnam Jr. accused 62 people, several of whom were executed, of being witches. She was 12 years old. Her father, Thomas Putnam, accused 43 people, but forensic people who do forensic analysis of handwriting have actually found his handwriting in a lot of other accusations. So he may have accused as many as 100 people. Almost every accuser in Salem was somehow related or married into the Putnam family. And almost every person they accused was related or married into the Porter family. The Salem witch trials, you'll recall, ended because of the final intervention of Governor William Phipps, whose wife had been accused of being a witch. He ordered the shutting down of the admission of spectral evidence in the courtroom, and then he finally shut down the court of Oyer and Terminer, and the Salem witch trial shuddered to an end. He also ordered, Phipps did, that nobody was permitted to talk publicly or write about the Salem witch trials for 5 years. He put a 5-year moratorium, almost like a cooling down period. And then he ended the moratorium on January 15, 1697, with a day of fast and repentance, where the entire colony came together and asked God for forgiveness for the sin of accusing people of being witches and placing them on trial. This unleashed, this day of fast and repentance, a tsunami of writing and commentary and self-reflection about the Salem witch trials. It was devastating for religious people in New England to understand what this colony had done. And it was deeply shameful. Here's a tour book, I think from 1888, for tourists who want to go to Salem. Wonderful town, here are the sites of the witch trials, but don't you dare ask a resident about it because they're very defensive. So as late as 1888, Salemers are defensive about the witch trial. Salem Village is so ashamed of what had happened that in 1752 they changed their name to Danvers to try and shed the memory of the witch trials. And it was something that had a long historical memory. those families of those who had been executed and even accused sued the Massachusetts Bay Colony for reparations and won. The last lawsuit was settled in 1741, almost 50 years after the witch trials had started. So this is an episode with a very long life. You know, Danvers tries to shed the association with the Salem witch trials, and I wonder if Danvers wishes they had never changed their name, because that means that all those tourists who want to see the witch trials, they go to Salem town. And Salem town, you know, makes millions every year from all this is a town that embraces it. Here's Elizabeth Montgomery statue. Their high school football team is called the Witches. They're called the Witch City. This is a police patch. I mean, they absolutely embrace it. If you know any, I'm just going to go very quickly over this. If you know any young historian, tell them that a good subject for study is not the Salem witch trials, which has been well studied. It's how the Salem witch trials, how our founding fathers remembered the Salem witch trials. Because I'm convinced that they did. They made reference to them. Benjamin Franklin, raised by Puritans. John Adams, raised by Puritans. The Salem witch trials were something of a warning sign in their heads. And I'm convinced that the Salem witch trials was absolutely an important piece of the ideology that was expressed at the Constitutional Convention of 1787, ensuring, and afterwards in the ratification, ensuring that there would be freedom of religion. That this was something this was a road that we were going to go down. We were going to go down the road of Roger Williams, not Cotton Mather. I thought I'd end with the story of Ann Putnam Jr., who I've mentioned many times, the only woman I've ever known who has Jr. at the end of her name. And she was 12 years old during the witch trials. She accused a lot of people. And she lived a very sad life. Her parents died shortly after the witch trials. She was the eldest of 10 children, and so she raised the other children. She was always sick. She died young. But before she died, she came before the church and asked for forgiveness. And the church accepted it and welcomed her back into the church. This was read by the son of Rebecca Nurse. I desire to be humbled before God for that sad and humbling providence that befell my father's family in the year about 92. That I, then being in my childhood, should, by such a providence of God, be made an instrument for the accusing of several persons of a grievous crime, whereby their lives were taken away from them, whom now I have just grounds and good reason to believe they were innocent persons, and that it was a great delusion of Satan that deceived me in that sad time. And particularly, as I was the chief instrument of accusing good wife Rebecca Nurse and her 2 sisters, I desire to lie in the dust and to be humbled for it, in that I was a cause with others of so sad a calamity to them and their families, for which cause I desire to lie in the dust, and earnestly beg forgiveness of God, and for all those unto whom I have given just cause of sorrow and offense, whose relations were taken away or accused. This confession was read, it says here, August 25th, 1706, to the congregation. She acknowledged it. It was read by, again, Rebecca Nurse, who was executed as a witch, by her son. Her son personally welcomed Ann Putnam Jr. back into the fold. And I think there is something, I said that in every American heart, I believe there beats, in every American chest, there beats a heart of a Puritan, whether we know it or not, or whether we like it or not. I think the Puritans have had a really profound impact on our society and culture, in good ways and bad. And I think one of the good ways is that, Americans, for all our faults, we really do believe in second chances. And I think a lot of that does come from the Puritan spirit. Thank you. I'm going to be back in 3 weeks. 3 weeks from tonight. So 3 weeks from tonight, I'm going to start a new series on this guy. And that's a picture of him right there. Alexander Hamilton. All right?
Oh, that's Hamilton.